I fondly recall my early morning experience of waking up in my room in Ashale, Accra, with the sun rising and the sounds of the city becoming louder. Roosters crowing, the azan from a nearby mosque calling for the first morning prayer, the fajr to be conducted, at times intermingling with Christian hymns and Pentecostal clapping, all couched in the sound of rising traffic. It is this multiplicity of sensations that has prompted me to think about how all those making and hearing these various sounds that are partly tied to specific religious identities situate themselves vis-à-vis co-present others in urban space. Once getting up and leaving the house, the sense of a co-presence of multiple audible and visible signs is enhanced as one witnesses so many images and inscriptions that call for attention, with a central presence of Christian ones. Indeed, cities assemble people who are different from each other in all sorts of ways, and who, for that reason, must develop modalities of coexistence that deal with difference, distance, and otherness. Regarding Accra, I have always been struck by the question how conspicuous religious conviction and a rather convivial atmosphere might go together. How do the inhabitants of this ever-expanding metropole arrange their co-presence in a practical manner in everyday life? How does urban space afford modalities of religious coexistence? Behind such empirical questions looms the issue of how to develop suitable new approaches, concepts, and methods to conduct research. And this is, of course, also one of the concerns of your conference. I see world making as a political aesthetic endeavor located in specific times and places, embedded in power relations that shape people's perceptions and sensations in ways that embed them in particular worlds construed and their regimes of truth. My interest lies not so much in the making of one single religious world from the inside. Instead, I am interested in the areas between multiple coexisting worlds where they appear porous and unstable, where boundaries may be drawn or let go. Studying urban religious world making, in my work, I place particular attention to two dimensions. One, the importance of a material approach to urban religious configurations. As I argue in the framework of our Religious Matters in an Entangled World research at Utrecht University, this approach calls attention to materials, buildings, all sorts of objects, clothes, posters, food, pictures, out of which worlds are constituted and how they are apprehended and impinge on people's self-understanding and practices. This allows to spot religion in urban spaces, not only as a lived practice, but also as a material manifestation. Second, the coexistence of urban religious worlds in the same spaces. People with different religious identities move about in shared common grounds in which they encounter the same material forms, churches, mosques, etc., and the associated imagery and soundscapes, which they, however, perceive differently. Taking such forms as anchor points for analysis, we are able to identify potential zones of conflict, clashing meanings and values, as well as potentials for overlap and understanding. As cities are plural by default, the making and imposition of one total world onto them is impossible, even if one way of world making may be dominant and hegemonic. I want to stress that I do not understand plurality as the sum of neatly distinguishable entities which all belong to the species of religion. Plurality refers to a social space in which multiple religious and secular others coexist in a particular political order. The coexistence of adherents of various religious traditions is not to be seen in terms of a homogenized plurality of equivalent parts, but as a historically constituted heterogeneous configuration rife with tensions and power relations. In Ghana, Christians are in the majority and have more power to imprint urban space with Christian markers than Muslims, who started to manifest themselves more strongly over the past decade, let alone practitioners of indigenous spirituality who are just getting out of the shadow into which they have been pushed for long. Placing the dynamics of religious coexistence center stage draws attention to all sorts of organized and expected, as well as informal and unexpected ways in which people relate to religious others, in a convivial or conflict mode, and anything in between, using multiple channels for communication, which include but also exceed dialogue. In other words, understanding plurality as more than the sum of its parts brings into the picture the interstices in which differences become apparent and are negotiated. Georg Simmel proposes that interstices, Zwischenräume, are the locations where different actors become aware of and relate to each other. Once people start relating to each other, the space between them appears animated and lively, achieving a social territorial reality. Interstices are used spaces in between persons and other elements that relate to each other in multiple ways. The notion of interstice is of great conceptual and methodological use to operationalize the political dynamics emerging between such elements across different kinds of religious and other boundaries, opening up a transforming and potentially creative space. In 2017, the historian Samuel Tewusu and I launched the Madina project as a collaboration of junior and senior scholars in Ghana and the Netherlands to study modalities of coexistence in this religiously and ethnically plural neighborhood. Located on Ga, traditional land, the area popularly called Madina, Madina being Arabic for city, got urbanized with the influx of northern Muslims who were resettled in the area in the late 1950s. The official name is La Nkwatanang Madina, and according to the 2021 population census, La Nkwatanang Madina has about 250,000 inhabitants. The focus of our research, however, is more limited as we look at the two zongos from which Madina evolved initially. A zongo is an Hausa term to denote places for strangers, and usually Muslims. Here, Muslims form the majority, so it's an exceptional Islamic pocket in the otherwise strongly Christian south of Ghana, while Christians are also present. In this environment, Muslims and Christians negotiate their relations with their religious and ethnic others, as well as with the traditional Ga authorities on whose land Madina is located, and who are known for their attitude of opening up to strangers for the benefit of the community. It is a neighborhood of newcomers and strangers with the Zongos at its center. As a cosmopolitan place par excellence, new goods, images, and ideas from all over the world, from China, the Middle East, Europe, and the US, touch ground in Madina and are appropriated by its inhabitants into new styles. In other words, in new styles. We focus on material forms which connect and separate, and thus are common to people with different religious affiliations. And we look at uses of space, that's Joseph Fosu-Ankra, who will also speak here, negotiations of food, Rashida Al-Hassan Atumata, beauty practices, Kausa Kamis, and the pursuit of health, Martin Luther Dako. For inhabitants of Madina, their identity as Muslims or Christians has much weight, overshadowing ethnicity, age, and class to some extent. The emphasis on religion as a constitutive part of identity has been heightened with the rise of Pentecostal and Islamic reform movements, which draw a strong contrast between faith and the world. While many people publicly express their religious identities in a marked, material, and bodily manner, they all the same deploy a pragmatics of coexistence. As a shared space, Madina is an environment in which urban religiosities are deployed, yet also reach certain limits, as no religion can impose a closed regime on Madina as a whole. We decided to not give priority to mosques, churches, and shrines, and to concentrate instead on how people navigate and negotiate the messy urban space which they share with others. The focus of our project are the interstices in which people with different religious convictions relate to each other in urban space. Focusing on such interstices raises other questions than a focus on bounded religious sites and the messages preached there. It leads right into the manners in which inhabitants of Madina are developing conscious and unconscious modalities of coexistence and are coping with ambivalences arising between ideals and necessities. Involving multiple dimensions, political, religious, aesthetic, moral, sensorial, the relations between Muslims, Christians, and traditionalists may range from contestation and conflict to indifference to cordial conviviality. Our researchers found that Madina's inhabitants tend to eschew huge conflicts, even though there is much potential for clashes. As reported by scholar of Islamic Studies and Education, Rabiatu Amma, who is also part of our team members, in Madina there is a saying, fitna, trouble, is asleep until you wake it up. To not wake trouble up by staying cool seems to be an important part of an everyday ethics of living together. As a team, we have studied the modalities of coexistence that shape how people relate to each other in the same habitat from grounded, material, corporeal, and gender angles. And Joseph will speak about his research in a moment. Here I want to highlight, by way of example, some findings from the work of Rashida Al-Hassan Adoum Atta. She has conducted research on a section of the Madina market where imported pig feet, trotter, from Europe, including Germany and the Netherlands, are sold. This is a predominantly Muslim market, and she learned that Muslim customers try to stay aloof from this part for fear of being polluted. They have strong feelings of disgust facing the sight and smell of trotter. Trotter sellers also know that they are regarded as polluted and polluting by Muslims. Therefore, they may hide their business. Navigating the interstice requires a management of one's personal boundaries through practices of spiritual closure via a spiritual shield and proxemic distancing. Clearly, living together in plurality requires constant work to retain a degree of closure towards others. Adoum Atta's Muslim interlocutors told her that they could eat chicken and beef dishes cooked by Christians. No problem about that. They could pray before eating, invoking Bismillah Allahu Akbar, in short Bismillah, so as to make the meat halal in retrospect. People find a way of negotiating a potential pollution by invoking Bismillah on it. What matters is the good intention. Similarly, Christians also revert to prayer so as to cleanse items they eat from potential spiritual demonic dangers. Next to religious techniques to cope with the threat of pollution and danger of spiritual intrusion, we also found practices of accommodating things from the other. In her research on female beauty practices, Kauthar Kamis shows how Muslim and Christian women, in their struggle to remain beautiful in an aesthetic, ethical, and erotic sense, offer each other advice in beauty salons. Kamis documents how Muslim brides negotiate conservative prerogatives communicated to them by imams and elders in such a way that some innovation and pushing of boundaries occurs while falling out of the scope of behavior, without falling out of the scope of behavior deemed acceptable for a faithful woman. Similarly, Christian ladies with a background in churches with strict dress codes for women also experiment to push the boundaries of the permissible. Interestingly, some women started to adopt Muslim dress styles, such as the hijab, and during the Corona pandemic, even the niqab, arguing that in these clothes they feel better protected at night and also against the virus. The example of the beauty salons as interstices in which beauty practices are mixed shows that religious identities are not necessarily put up front in engagement with others. Commonalities with regard to gender, ethnicity, and profession are also recognized, and women are eager to embrace fashion, thereby pushing religious dress codes to the limits. So, to conclude, a detailed study of relations and exchanges across religious boundaries in the interstices opening up outside of the doors of mosques and churches towards the messy world of everyday life brings into the picture all sorts of small yet effective and sustained practices of coexisting, we could say in pianissimo. While it would be mistaken to see Madina as a coexistence paradise, I want to stress the broadly shared attitude of live and let live, a kind of, at times, as Joseph calls it, unfriendly tolerance. The texture of everyday life in Madina is made up of myriad small exchanges seeking to keep fitna asleep as much as possible, thus managing ambivalence by recognizing the co-presence of inconsistencies, challenges, desires, and tensions. So for this particular research project, the interstice offers a conceptual frame that allows us to gain a much clearer understanding of how people do coexistence than if we had started from the anthropology of Islam and the anthropology of Christianity, or from a fixed idea about policies of regulating religion on the part of the state. The figure of the interstice leads us beyond these anthropologies and the level of state policies, which I appreciate for the insights they helped us gain, yet which, in my view, it is time to transcend so as to address the pressing issues of how people, against all odds and against their religious convictions and cultural ethnic views, may manage to find a common ground in the in-between. The interstice is both a reality in the world out there, in between the fixed and fenced entities about and with which we are used to think and perceive, and a figure for perception that may help us to see the at first sight difficult to grasp movements and relations in between. And in this sense, the interstice is an attitude that we can cultivate, indeed, a queer mode of perception and theorizing. Thank you for your attention.